having a Higherside chat with Martin Ball. He's the author of several books about life and psychedelics, such as Being Human, Mushroom Wisdom, and the Entheogenic Evolution. He also hosts a podcast by the same name. Martin, welcome to THC.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.
Can we start by telling the people how you got started with psychedelic compounds and how they've kind of affected your life and your outlook on reality?
Okay, wow. Well, that's sort of a long story, but to make it short,
Sure.
My first experience with what are called psychedelics or entheogens was after my first year of college, and I was home for the summer and going with some friends to a festival called Gathering of the Vibes in Northern California, which was my first time ever going to a big festival like that. It was very eye-opening, and actually as we were driving into the event, some guy was walking along the line of cars of people driving in, just saying, shrooms, shrooms. And the friend of mine who was driving the car, leaned out and was like, yeah, hey, come on over here. And so he bought some mushrooms from this guy. And, looking back on it, I think they were mostly just stems and not quite sure how much was in the bag or anything. Because I'd never even seen a mushroom before. I had no idea what they did. So that was just my very first experience. And that was kind of at the beginning of the summer. So then I kind of got into it over the course of that summer and did mushrooms a few more times and was really amazed by the experiences. But then shortly after that, probably in the fall or winter following that summer, I really started kind of breaking through into kind of psychedelic states of consciousness whenever something would remind me of my mushroom experiences. So it would be anything from like seeing a patterned rug or looking at the shapes of leaves in the trees that it would just set me off. And that actually was very uncomfortable for me at the time. So there was quite a time period there where I did not use any entheogens because that was just really disturbing. And I would really panic when that would happen. And so my heart rates would increase. And, I ended up at a cardiologist, and I was diagnosed with a heart murmur and stuff. So I was really disturbed by the whole thing. But, looking back on it now, I really realized that really I was kind of breaking through a lot of things, and it just scared the crap out of me at the time because I didn't have any frame of reference for what was happening to me. And so that's where I started with entheogens, was working with mushrooms. And eventually I went back to working with mushrooms a couple years later and really had what I considered to be really profoundly impactful breakthrough experience. Probably, I think that was the spring break of my first year of graduate school. So this was now a few years later. And that became a very foundational experience for me and really was the basis for writing my book, Mushroom Wisdom, which I actually wrote about 10 years after that event, that particular event. So I would work with mushrooms kind of off and on over the years. Generally, that involved me traveling up to Oregon to see a friend of mine who lived up here and visiting him and going out into the redwoods and taking mushrooms with him. So he was kind of my trip buddy. And along the way, it was actually my first year at Burning Man. That was 2001. Before I went to Burning Man, I read this article in the LA Times about this crazy new psychedelic that people were getting interested in called Salvia divinorum and how it was legal.
Yes.
And you could order it right off the internet, and then they gave the website. And so I was like, wow, this is great. Here it is in the LA Times. It's fantastic. So I ordered up some Salvia divinorum from Daniel Siebert at Sage Wisdom. And from there, I had my first salvia experience at Burning Man and instantly just loved salvia. It was just great. I mean, the first couple hits I took, I read that this is really strong. It comes on really fast. So I took some really timid hits at the very, very beginning of that, and nothing really happened. So then, I kind of packed another bowl, and I took a big hit, and then it just happened. Just salvia happened, and I loved it. It was just so fantastic, which later I was to learn that actually it terrifies most people. And
yes, that's true.
Yeah, most people who have their first salvia experience swear that they'll never go back to it again. But I was just so empowered. I was so jazzed. It's like, oh, this is great. This is so great. So I worked with salvia for a few years, starting in 2001. And for a long time, my only experience with entheogens was mushrooms and Salvia divinorum. And also in that time period, I started writing kind of on a whim. I just decided that I wanted to write my own fantasy epic, so I did. And that ended up being 4 books long. And at the end of that,
Wow.
after I wrote those books, I realized that I really had put everything that I had learned from entheogens into those 4 novels. And so I thought, well, maybe I could extract some of this information and write a little book about what spirituality and entheogens means to me. And that was then the product, my book, Mushroom Wisdom, came out of that. So that's when I first really started writing explicitly about entheogens. And then after that, I published a book on sage, or on Salvia Divinorum, called Sage Spirit. And yeah, so that's kind of how I got started in the field. Also, I should emphasize that when I was a graduate student, I was in religious studies. So
Right, yeah. That's what I was going to ask you, how it shaped, because your opinion going from college had to be quite different, I would assume, once you started doing mushrooms and salvia.
Yeah, well, I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate. And actually, before I was a philosophy major, my split was, am I going to go into physics or am I going to go into philosophy? That I knew from high school that I was really interested in both those subjects. I was fairly proficient in calculus and things like that, so I really felt that I could go in either direction. And at the beginning of college, I just found that I was so enthusiastic about my philosophy classes that I thought, okay, I'll be a philosophy major. And then after a couple years of that, I got more and more interested in religious studies because I found that in philosophy I was really just getting dead white guys from Europe, which was great. There's a lot of interesting information there, but I was just more curious than that I wanted to see, well, what else is out there? So I ended up going into religious studies. And then as a graduate student, I emphasized Native American traditions. I actually did my PhD dissertation living at the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. So Native American traditions. Wow. Shamanism, comparative mysticism, and the philosophy of science and religion. Those were really my main areas as a graduate student. So it's kind of my own personal seeking was going on at the same time that I was doing all these academic studies and really just reading a lot, studying a lot. I mean, being a graduate student at UCSB was really kind of horrendous. I mean, I just read so much studying and reading, and then studying languages. I studied Sanskrit for a while. I taught myself Navajo so that I could learn Apache when I went to the Apache reservation because there's no materials on learning Apache. So it's quite an experience being a graduate student. And all the while, kind of on the side, doing my thing with the medicines, and then reading up on it within the area of religious studies as much as I could. But at that time, there's actually a lot more material that's available now. That was out of a period where there were some materials on ethnobotany. So there's some interesting things out there, but not a whole lot written on the connection between religion, especially the main religions, and possible connections to entheogens and things like that. So the field has shifted quite a bit by this point in time.
Right.
Anyway, that's my sort of long story short, but I guess I only a little of it. But I thought I'd give you a chance to ask a question or talk.
No, that's cool. Well, I just got done reading Being Human, which I thought was pretty eye-opening. But on the subject of religion, you start off in that book by explaining away most traditional views of God as false projections of our own egos.
Yeah.
And I think most people listening would probably agree with that. But, I mean, do you think these God as king concepts, do you think they were born out of our collective ignorance and a fear of death? Or do you think they're more sinister, like a orchestrated perversion to control society?
No, it's just a natural byproduct of the ego. The ego formulates all different kinds of ways of conceptualizing whatever it wants to think is sacred. And that just happens to be one kind of formulation that became very predominant within first Middle Eastern societies and then spread through Hellenic and Greek culture and then Roman culture and then kind of infected all of European culture, this idea of God as king. I mean, there was a lot of different ideas around before Christianity and Judaism and sort of their monotheistic view of this all-transcendent, all-powerful male God that ultimately gets pissed off a lot and has a lot of rules. That's all a projection of the ego, just like all the different formulations of the various gods and goddesses. They're all just formulations of the ego. They set up a dualistic experience between someone who is feeling separate and isolated and then projecting outward some notion of some kind of transcendent other that they can look to, and it just becomes a way that people formulate their identities and their sense of being in the world. So I don't think that there's anything necessarily nefarious about it. Certainly it plays in really well with the male masculine hegemonic power and, you know, patriarchal domination. It fits great, and it, you know, serves society in that capacity for a long time.
But you just kind of think it's something we just stumbled into.
Yeah, essentially it's just one of various possibilities. You know, it's just such a natural reaction. Like, take Buddhism, for example. So early Buddhism, Buddha is really, really clear. He says, look, I'm not a god. Don't be worshiping me. Don't be praying to me. Don't be looking to me to solve all your problems. And you know what? I'm just a man who has figured out the nature of reality. And guess what? It's non-dual, folks. There really is no such thing as an individual self, that whatever it is that you think you are, that's not you. That was kind of Buddha's main message. And also that we produce our own suffering, our own unhappiness by the confusion of our ego. So there, Buddha was really right on. And he made it very clear that when he was dead, he was gone. And he's not someone that people should be praying to or something like that. But then, you know, some 500 years later, we get these developments of Mahayana Buddhism, which is altering very greatly from early original Buddhism, which now develops sort of this do-gooder kind of attitude, which is also an expression of the ego. When you convince yourself that, oh, I have to help everybody else, well, that's still a construction of your own sense of self and still exertion of your ego. And within that manifestation of this new form of Buddhism, suddenly Buddha is turned into a god-like figure, and now suddenly he's someone you can pray to, and he lives in these heavenly realms, and he has these pure paradises, and if you pray to these different Buddhas, you can be reborn in these paradises. And then actually there's certain forms of Buddhism that say, in total contradistinction to early Buddhism, where Buddha said, if you want to be enlightened, you have to do it yourself. You have to focus your mind, and you have to figure it out, and ultimately you have to do it on your own. No one can do it for you. But then later Buddhism, like Pure Land Buddhism, says, oh, we lived in such a degenerate age that we are powerless, and so we have to turn to a deity that's transcendent and beyond us and pray and worship that deity so that we can be reborn in that deity's paradise. And so here in Buddhism, this is this ego movement away from really the stark reality that Buddha was talking about, that, hey, it's up to you, and there's no real gods the way that you think of them involved here. Just suddenly Buddha gets transformed and morphed into this all-powerful male god kind of figure. And it's a little bit more abstract than that, but it's the workings of the ego, and it alters the tradition. So it's just the way that egos work, that it tends to be easier for an ego to form a sense of identity if it thinks that there's some all-powerful force outside of it that it can put its allegiance into and put its belief into. And it makes things easier for certain aspects of the ego to have conceptions like that. So, you know, really true non-dual traditions are something that's very, very rare in human culture. And most human cultures would much rather prefer to worship a transcendent deity that exists outside of the self in some sense, because it's easier for the ego. So that's why that's the predominance in terms of religious constructions around the world. We see it's very rare that you find the individuals like Buddha or perhaps Lao Tzu in Taoism that says, hey, you know, guess what? It's actually you, and so you got to figure out who you are, and you can't be looking to other people to, or other entities or forces to solve that for you, because that's ultimately an illusion. It's a projection that you're creating.
Right. No, that's fair. I mean, I totally think that people seek that out. I just kind of think that there's forces at play that take advantage of the knowledge that we sort of seek out some savior.
Yeah, but that's human. That's human nature. That's the ego as well. That the ego is always going to use whatever tools that it has at its disposal to its perceived or imagined advantage. I mean, it's just what people do. So I mean, in coming to my own sense of realization that I've really let go of all kind of judgment. I'm certainly very discerning, so I make very strong
Right.
distinctions between what I say is fantasy and what is reality. But within that, I really don't hold any judgment. That ultimately, from my perspective now, I really appreciate the fact that humanity is deeply, deeply, deeply confused. And because of that, it makes all kinds of choices that are far from optimal. But within that, people generally they're just trying to do whatever it is that they can. And we can't really blame people for taking advantage of ego delusion, because egos make it so easy. So it's kind of like you're asking for it. If you're going to play the game, you're going to have to play the game. And it doesn't matter if you like the rules or not, because you're...
I'll give you that, yeah. No, that's good. Another thing I really liked about Being Human, in terms of your sort of philosophy, it's kind of interesting because when it comes to your views on death, you basically share the same opinion as an atheist in that you pretty much just go away. But you're also of the idea that God is an intelligent being responsible for creating the universe. So that's kind of funny that you incorporate both of those views.
Well, I want to be really specific about it, that it's not that God created the universe. God is the universe. God is
correct.
reality itself. God is everything that exists. So that means God is you and God is me, and that's what we are. So our sense of being an individual perspective is something that I now fully understand is dependent upon the fact that consciousness is being processed through a physical body. So once the physical body is gone, that individual sense of perspective simply doesn't have anywhere to adhere. So it essentially vanishes. But within that, so from your individual perspective, paradoxically, your life will seem to come to an end at some point. However, you actually are God. You are all of reality. So all of reality isn't going to disappear when you die. All the rest of us are still going to be here, and that's actually you. So just the physical body is gone, and the perspective that is associated and is generated from the reality of that physical body, that now dissolves. There's nowhere for that to adhere to anymore. So essentially, yes, death is the end, but our whole experience of time is ultimately just a paradox, because given that there is only one being, and that one being is everything, that means that we actually are eternal and immortal. But from that unitary perspective, that also is the equivalent to no time at all. Eternity and no time and infinity and nothing, those are all the same thing, ultimately. So from that perspective, there's nothing happening. It's only within our embodied perspectives that we perceive or experience anything as happening. So without the body, we don't have a sense of time anymore. So then there's nothing happening, but it's happening forever. So ultimately it's a paradox in that sense.
Okay, so basically, I mean, would you say, what do you think of the out-of-body experience or astral projection? You think those are just illusionary as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
When, and speaking about entheogens, what I like to do is kind of correct the language that people don't have out-of-body experiences. They have beyond-the-body experiences. But for the most part, those are energetic constructions that they're making within their own consciousness as a projected experience. And in that sense, it's very similar to what occurs when we're having a dream. It's like when you're dreaming, you perceive yourself generally from the perspective of a body in an environment with other objects and other beings. And so your dream ultimately seems very real in the sense that it's populated by other people, other beings, and all kinds of physical objects. And it also seems to obey the rules of gravity. I mean, most of the time in our dreams, we're not flying around. Sometimes we do, but most of the time we're walking around and everything's perfectly normal. And if suddenly we find ourselves breathing underwater, we're usually pretty surprised, like, whoa, crap, I can't do that. We're breathing underwater. So most of the normal rules of reality tend to hold together within a dream. And within the dream, we associate as our own particular character from our perspective within our body, within the dream. However, the entire dream is a projection of your own private individual mind. There's nothing in the dream that isn't you. Even though you perceive yourself as an individual body in an exterior environment, that exterior environment is just as much you as the body that you're projecting yourself being in within the dream. So for me, out-of-body experiences, I've never encountered anyone who's been able to convince me that what it is that they claim that they're experiencing is not just a projection of themselves. And usually when you really get down to people's specific individual details of what it is that they experience, it's fairly easy to analyze how it's a projection of their egos. And sometimes, it's really kind of shockingly easy. So
Yeah.
I've never been convinced by anybody's account, because I can always see the ego at work. And I would also add that that's my perspective now. This has not always been my perspective.
Right.
I went through a fundamental transformation, started really in late 2007 and kind of finished up in spring of 2009. And since that time, my own perspective has been extraordinarily clear on these matters. And so for things that for me used to be, I don't know, that might be true, that's so fascinating, it's just not the case anymore. That having found my own clarity, it's just very clear to me. It's either ego or it's reality. And
Sure.
for me, there really isn't any middle ground. So I have very high standards for that. And I know that it can be very challenging for people to encounter what I have to say because it seems very authoritative and very very insistent. And sometimes I might appear not to be open to people's ideas, but it's because I've explored these things. Yeah, I've explored all of this myself, and these are the conclusions that I've reached. And the only way I could be convinced otherwise is if my experience somehow shifted to where I'd say, oh, wow, look at that. But, I've gone to the end, and it's just me. It's always been me. That's just the conclusion that I've arrived at. And so that's what I'm sharing with other people and doing my best to explain how that works and why it works the way that it does and what it means for us as human beings.
Yeah. It makes sense to me. I'm still figuring stuff out. I'm not convinced of anything yet. Like before I did Salvia, I was definitely a pretty hardcore atheist, and to me it was like I did not expect Salvia to be what it was. I actually kind of thought it was a milder marijuana in some terms, just because
surprise.
Yeah, it was legal. So I had a friend from out of town. It was legal in this state, in California, and he's like, oh, let's try it. And I'm like, all right, I've tried it before. It just feels like spinning in an office chair. It's nothing. And all of a sudden, I was not in the room. And it was, oh, man, it was fucked. And it was the feeling that my personality and my inner voice was still intact, yet I was sensing something else entirely. It was that feeling that sort of made me think maybe there's something else to life. It made me not so much of an atheist, but it's interesting that you have such experience with psychedelics and you just come to such a different conclusion. When I read your book, it makes perfect sense. I do hear when people get deep, deep, deep with DMT, a lot of times they talk about the oneness, and there's all kinds of coded messages in the Bible about when your two eyes become one, blah, 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 body of light and stuff. And, it makes sense. You'll see those things all throughout different old cultures and old societies.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's out there. And, again, I really want to emphasize how much my own perspective has really radically shifted on this. Because, thinking back to my own early experiences with entheogens, that certainly part of what drew me to the experience was suddenly realizing, maybe all this spiritual stuff is really totally real, because this is the most bizarre thing, that there do seem to be these alternate realities and all these energies and all these different dimensions and all of this stuff. And so that's really what drew me into exploring it. But something that was important, looking back now, as I see my own trajectory of how I got to where I am, I can see that my hesitance to commit to any particular view was actually the most important thing that I could do. Because, I do see a lot of people who get to working with entheogens, and maybe they train with a shaman, and then they're all about spirits, and they're really fundamentally convinced that all of this stuff is really, really real. But as I was going through my own experiences, since it was mostly what I was doing on my own, I didn't really have anyone around to tell me what was or wasn't the case, so I really didn't develop any solid views, but I really had a lot of wondering. I really wondered about all these questions about afterlife, about reincarnation, about karma, about spirit entities, about disincarnate intelligence, about astral projection. And I had a lot of these experiences, and many of them were very convincing to me. But also there was, underneath it all, there was always this nagging sense of, this is really just you. But I couldn't identify, well, why is that? And also, honestly, a large part of my ego fought against that because it kept telling me that's so egotistical to think something like that. That's so arrogant to think that somehow this is all your experience, that this is all coming from you, that you're just so egotistical that you think that these other realms are you, that these other beings are you. So I really resisted that for a long time until it came to the point where not admitting that to myself, that it was all me, that I would be lying to myself in the deepest core of my being, and I had reached a point where I was no longer going to lie about anything, either to myself or anyone, period. I was done. I was done hiding from the truth, and so I reached a point where I had to admit, as much as my ego wanted to resist it, I had to admit that essentially I was God in human form, just as everyone else is, and that's reality. And that was shocking. That was absolutely shocking for me because, for one, I wasn't a theist in any kind of way. I was kind of a shamanic Buddhist is how I would have identified myself, and to be overwhelmed with this knowledge that, my God, there really is only one being, and it's a being, and it's intelligent, and it's alive, and it's all of reality, and it's me, and whatever it was that I thought I was, that ego that was having all these experiences, that was all just a game. It's all just this false construct. That was shattering for me. It really shattered my world, and the book Being Human was the result, and ever since then, so I wrote that in summer, fall of 2009, and ever since then I've essentially been writing the same thing over and over again in just different formats and highlighting different ideas and aspects. I actually just released a short ebook today called All is One, Understanding Entheogens and Non-Dualities, and so I'm still writing about the exact same thing. That in some sense I'm kind of a broken record at this point. As I wrote in this little ebook, once you figured out what it is that you have to say, there really isn't anything else to say at that point. So
fair.
I just keep saying it in different formats.
Well, a lot of New Age people, they'll also talk about, we're all one and it is all us. But they come to they take it a different direction in that they kind of go with this whole, well, now that you know your true nature, you can manifest your reality. But I haven't heard that from you.
Yeah, that's a lot of ego crap. Because the game is much, 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 much more sophisticated than that. And unless you really know who you are, unless you really know yourself, you actually don't know what you want. Because all of reality is actually one massive energetic system that runs on self-love. Now, if you're confused about who you are, and if you're confused about what reality is, then you're going to be very, very confused about what it is that you actually want. So the ego may want one thing. The ego says, oh, I really, 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 really want this. But your genuine energy that you are might have very, very different plans for you. And it really doesn't matter what your ego thinks or what your ego wants. And that is why sometimes reality is absolutely horrific and really horrible, nasty things happen that apparently that no one would want that in their right mind. But you have to understand that, for one, God doesn't give a shit, in the sense that God doesn't take anything personally. And we are all just pawns on the chessboard of reality that is this one being. And it's kind of like if you watch a movie and if you see a character really suffering in the movie, and you can imagine, wow, I bet that character doesn't want that. I mean, look, he just got his head chopped off or something like that.
Yeah.
From the perspective of the director who's making the movie, it doesn't matter whether that character wants that or not. It's moving the story forward for whatever reason. And that's ultimately all that we are. We're all just little characters. And since all the characters that are playing on the chessboard, since they're all actually the same being, it doesn't really matter which one wins or which one loses or which one eats the other one or kills the other one or marries the other one or does anything else, because it's all the same being. So we're all, in that sense, ultimately disposable. But so once we start thinking about, well, what are my own personal desires and how do I manifest them? Well, the reality is you get clear in yourself and then you work on it. You can't sit around and think about, oh, well, I really want this or I really want that. I mean, that's just the ego playing with itself. And, sometimes it seems to work, and then the ego says, oh, wow, it really totally worked. But most of the time, people are just deluding themselves when they're thinking that way. It's harsh, I know, but...
No, I mean, it's fair to say, because I've wondered things like, how do you account for really random car accidents? Who's manifesting that? Something nobody expected or saw coming. Like, I guess the argument is, oh, well, maybe deep in the back of their mind they were a pessimist and they were just, welcoming negative energy. And
yeah, or then people then they'll fall back on ideas of karma and like, oh, well, they had it coming from a previous life or something. And it's just ways that people make excuses for themselves. And it's also a way that people use to get after themselves. Oh, I should be more positive. I should just change my mind and things will be better. And believe me, I fell into that as well. Prior to kind of this radical break that I made with myself, I was living in a relationship for many, many years that I was very unhappy in and leading a life that ultimately I really censored myself and shut myself down and didn't allow myself to be myself. And all the way through, I kept telling myself, I just need to change my perspective. I need to be more optimistic. I'm just focusing on the negative. And, the reality is I needed to change my situation. And no amount of thinking was going to do that. It requires action. That's what reality is. Reality requires genuine action. There's a lot that we can do with our own perspective of how attached we get to certain outcomes that we may want. So I don't want to say that that's completely bogus, but when it comes to determining what you are really able to do within reality, you have to do it yourself. You can't expect reality to pander to you in some way if you just think the right thoughts or say the right prayers or do the right rituals or do the right dance or whatever it is that people think that they need to do, or say enough Hail Marys or spin the prayer wheel enough times. It's just the ego playing games. And so from my perspective at this point, it's simply a waste of energy. Well, you'd be much better off focusing on finding clarity within yourself and then choosing clearly which actions are going to bring you the greatest amount of happiness for the limited time that you have.
And what do you think is the best way to do that?
Entheogens.
Fair.
Definitely entheogens. So maybe I'll give a little bit more background on what happened in the sense of how I came to be able to write Being Human. So, like I said, my experience with entheogens was with mushrooms and with Salvia divinorum. And then in around 2007 or so, it was actually after I published my book, Mushroom Wisdom, that I had a guy who wanted a copy of the book, but he didn't have any money, but he said, hey, I'll trade you some stuff. So he sent me some yopo seeds at the time. And yopo seeds are seeds from trees in Central and South America that primarily contain 5-MeO-DMT, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine. So I started kind of working with that a little bit. It's really a pain in the ass. You have these seeds with this little cover on them, and you have to roast them so that the cover cracks, and you have to remove this little papery cover, and then you have like these roasted nuts, and then you have to crush up the roasted nuts, and then you can snort them, or you can smoke them. And so I found that, I preferred smoking them, but it just tastes really nasty. It's not a pleasant smoking experience by any means. So I had a few experiences with 5-MeO, but nothing that I now understand is a full release dose, an actual dose that's effective to bring you into a non-dual state of awareness. That I wasn't getting that. But anyway, I'll just skip over all the drama that led me to change my life. But I ended up leaving my wife. I left my job. I left my kids. I left California, and I ended up moving here to Ashland, Oregon. And very soon after I moved here, I didn't have any work. I was just busy looking for any kind of work. I connected with a guy by applying to a job that he had written the ad for. And he checked out my website before contacting me. And at the time, I had a theme camp at Burning Man called the God Box. And kind of the nickname for the God Box was the Mystic Toad. And the Mystic Toad actually was a mailbox that I had created as this toad, and we had this whole ritual to go in to see the Mystic Toad and open the God box and see what's in there. There's this mailbox. So anyway, this guy kind of sees this on my website, and he says, "Oh, what kind of Mystic Toad do you have?" And I said, "Well, it's a mailbox." He said, oh, well, I have the real thing. And so what he was referring to is the Sonoran desert toad, or Bufo alvarius, and this is the only toad in the world that in its poison that it secretes from its glands, it contains 5-MeO-DMT, this extraordinarily powerful entheogenic or psychedelic compound. And also, I will say about 5-MeO-DMT, for anyone who's not familiar with it, that this is actually a molecule that's inside every single human being on the planet, and it's inside every mammal. And it's in countless species of plants and grasses. So it's really, really common within nature, somewhat similar to DMT in the sense that DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is also inside all humans and all mammals and in many different plants and various other things. So these are very, very common molecules. And kind of just to briefly describe the difference, DMT, well, that's the main active ingredient in ayahuasca, for example. And when you take that orally with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, then you experience DMT over the course of usually a couple hours, and sometimes it can be longer depending on the brew, the ayahuasca brew, and exactly what's in there.
Sure.
But if you smoke DMT, the experience is actually much stronger and it's much faster. So it comes on in a matter of seconds, and DMT then lasts for maybe 5 to 15 minutes, essentially, in terms of one experience with DMT. Now, 5-MeO-DMT, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, you can smoke that, and it comes on in a matter of seconds, and it is much, much, much stronger than DMT by many orders of magnitude, and it lasts from 20 to 40 minutes to maybe even an hour at times. So it's very, very strong. It's certainly incomparable to anything else I've ever encountered. That salvia, that's strong. DMT, that's strong. 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine it's off the charts in terms of strength when you get a full release dose. So anyway, this fellow invited me over to his house, and at the time 5-MeO-DMT was legal. It was only recently made illegal. That was like January 19th of 2011, something like that. So it's just been over a year or so that it's actually been illegal. So at the time it was legal, and he invited me over to his place. And the first time he invited me over, it was kind of a dud, didn't work. The second time he invited me over, within a matter of seconds, my only reality was God. And I had never experienced anything like that before. Whoever it was I thought I was just completely wiped out. The room that I was in was completely gone, and everything was pure, crystalline, fractal, rainbow white light that stretched on for infinity and was made of pure, pulsing, living, conscious love.
Wow.
And it completely overwhelmed me. So for the first time in my life, the first thing that came out of my mouth within seconds was just, "Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you." And I just went on like that for about an hour. So this was shattering, because still at that time I was still kind of Buddhist, and Buddha doesn't talk about God, and you maybe talk about the Buddha mind or the emptiness of consciousness, but this was a conscious being that was made out of love. And so for me, that was just God, and it was so overwhelming. So then that experience then precipitated a whole chain of events that I definitely don't have time to get into now, but it took about 14 months from that very first experience where, quote, Martin experienced God, and then Martin came back and said, "What the hell was that?" to after about 14 months of working with 5-MeO-DMT and also regularly attending the Santo Daime Church here in Ashland and drinking daime, which is a form of ayahuasca, and also working with mushrooms and salvia. It was a very, very intense time period. I was also very, very poor during this time period. It was very difficult in many ways. But at the end of it, there no longer was a distinction between what I thought of as myself and what I experienced as God. And so that was kind of the end of the process for me. And things have never been the same since then. And that actually, when that occurred, it literally was like a switch was flipped. And then for me at that point, there was no distinction between the 5-MeO-DMT experience and just normal everyday reality. And
Really?
yes, that divide was completely gone. So what that essentially means is that I felt like I was tripping mad all the time.
Yeah. How do you fit into this society that way?
I didn't know how that was going to work because when I really open up my energy, my voice changes, my voice gets very deep, my whole cadence and rhythm, the way that I speak changes. I become much more authoritative. I become very, very, very insistent in many ways. My whole body language changes. I become very geometric in the way that I move. I'm very symmetrical. And so it's very intense. I mean, from my wife's perspective, I met a lovely woman named Jessalyn here in Ashland and moved in with her, and we married each other. And when this occurred, from her perspective, Martin was simply gone. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know what had happened, but the man that she thought she loved was clearly no longer in the building. And it was really startling. And this, for me, this was, I was teaching at the university at the time. This is when I first started teaching at SOU. And this was the week before finals, so I had to go in and give my final lectures and, review everything for the final exams for my students. And I had no idea what was going to happen. So it was on a Friday night that my switch got flipped. And I had to go in on Monday and give a lecture. And all weekend long, I had just been tripping mad at home. And I was ecstatic. It was like, yes, I've been let out of prison. It was glorious. But anyway, I went to school, and I hadn't said anything to anybody. And I walked into the room, and one of my students said, "Oh, hi, Professor." And then I said, "Oh, hello." And suddenly my voice had gone back to the kind of the old Martin voice, even though it's a little bit different now than I used to sound. It more
Sucked back in.
Yeah, it kind of snapped back in, and my energy shifted. And I learned at that moment that as long as I completely trust that I can always be myself, that I'll be able to fit into any social situation. It's not an issue. So kind of a metaphor that I use this point is that I've learned that I kind of wear the structure of my ego as kind of a social navigation tool. So when I'm interacting with other people, I usually sound and act like Martin, unless they really start asking me questions, and then my energy will shift fairly dramatically. But other than that, I go out and I play the Martin character, and I'm very comfortable with it, and I enjoy it because I enjoy interacting with other people. I mean, that's kind of the point. But I had no idea how I was supposed to navigate that, and it was ultimately just learning to trust that as long as I was true to what I felt in my energy, everything would be fine. So I trust everything all the time. Just the way it goes.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my next question, is if you thought that, if you still battled with your ego, or if it was pretty much beaten into submission by this point. But it seems like you've turned it and you use it as a positive.
Yeah. One thing that I always like to stress with people is that, because a lot of people get the wrong idea about this. They talk about ego death, and they say, "Oh, I want to kill my ego. I want to get rid of my ego. I want to become this no self." And that's fundamentally an ego delusion, because your ego doesn't actually ever go away permanently. Now, we can transcend it for certain time periods, especially when we're working with entheogens. And actually, that reminds me, I want to come back to that issue, so I'll spin back to that in a second. But sure. We can transcend it for certain periods of time, and that's when we enter into the non-dual state of awareness. But then the ego reasserts itself. And so I went through this opening, closing. Every time I would take medicine, I would open, and then it would wear off, and I would close. And then I'd take more, and it'd open, and then it'd close, open, close. But what eventually happened is that I reached the point where kind of my ego opened. And now, rather than it automatically clamping back on and saying, "Oh, that's me," now I just kind of use it the same way that I might use my hand. If I want to drink water, I need to use my hand to reach over and get the glass, because I need to use my hand to do that. And there's some things that you kind of need to use your ego to do in the sense of interacting with other people. So I use it now. It's a part of me, but it's not the prison that it used to be. And that's a really, really, really radical difference. And it's not about killing the ego. It's about freeing yourself from it. And that means you have to learn that it's not actually you, that your ego does everything that it can to convince you in every moment of the day that it is you. And it's very believable, but it's also an excellent liar. So it's constantly making up this false sense of self and finding ways to reinforce that. So it takes a lot of work to get out of that prison and get out of that trap. And it's ultimately only something that you can do for yourself. So spinning back around now, this is why I started saying all this, was that entheogens are the best tool for this process, because the ego itself is a construction of limited energetic patterns. And these are patterns of ways that we think, ways that we act, ways that we choose to believe. And it even involves things like our body gestures, our tone of voice, the pitch of our voice, our accent if we have one. All of these things are ways that our ego is trying to shape our sense of self by using these patterns of energy. But they're ultimately limited patterns of energy, because in shaping a sense of self, we always have to distinguish between what we say is me versus not me. So these patterns create these limits and these barriers. Now, when you work with a really strong entheogen, like 5-MeO-DMT, or salvia, or DMT, I mean, these can all be very strong entheogens. But it's especially the ones that have these very fast expansion, this very fast come-on rate that are the most effective, because experientially what's happening is our energy is expanding into this beyond the body sense of being. And so it's expanding out very rapidly, and it's very hard for the ego to effectively hold on and maintain its energetic structures when that is occurring. So it's kind of like we're pushing on all of these structures. It's kind of like the ego is a dam. It's trying to hold back all this energy. And if the individual chooses to let go of all sense of self-identity, then their energy can expand out, and their sense of identification can then encompass everything, and that becomes the unitary or the non-dual or the mystical experience, where you realize, my God, it really is all one, and it's me, it's one, it's everything, it's the nature of being. But that only lasts as long as that energetic expansion that the medicines make possible within your body, it only lasts for that time period, and then that energy starts to collapse back in on itself after the peak, and then the ego starts to reintegrate, because it's very persistent. The ego always wants to be in charge. It says, oh, I've got something to do. I'm going to create my sense of self-identity again. I'm going to reestablish dualistic perception and experience. And so it jumps right in there and does that. But the way that I like to describe it is that ultimately the ego is an energetic problem, because it's an energetic process that goes on within our being, and it affects our whole sense of thought process, our emotions, our body. It affects everything that we are. And because it's this energetic issue, the solution to the problem of the ego is also an energetic solution. And the most effective energetic tool are entheogens, because they're essentially these little crystalline neurotransmitters that attach to various places within our body, and it amplifies our sense of energy. So it's a very, I like to kind of stress this naturalistic explanation for what's going on, because I don't feel that there's any need to resort to kind of spiritual terminology, or you're opening your third eye, or you're activating your chakras, or you're elevating your vibration. That's all just kind of the way that egos want to talk about and identify and create objects that they then reify within their experience. But it's just an energetic issue. So the entheogens are just, from a practical standpoint, they're just the best tool for accomplishing these states of awareness. And once people have non-dual experiences, if they really learn to work with that and be clear and present within that, they really can come to a deep understanding of who and what they are. And then they can start to take responsibility for themselves, so that their ego isn't projecting out everywhere and displacing energy and casting judgment and blame and being a victim and doing all these things that egos do. But you have to learn who you are in order to be able to learn how to not engage your ego, because it's always going to convince you that it's you. And so you have to have this understanding that it's not you. And it's not just an intellectual proposition. You have to experience it in order to really be able to learn to work with that.
Right on. Yeah, see, I've kind of gone down the thread of the whole idea of kind of reincarnation. Like, I've kind of just now started to explore those ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it kind of fits conveniently with psychedelics in the terms of when people say, oh, go in with an intent and you're going to learn something. And, you know, there's a big New Age push in that direction. But I guess my question is, if our individual perspective does not continue and it's just absorbed into the great beyond, what is really the point of even going through that transition in a lifetime, or the point of, this experience itself?
Well, the ultimate value is that it frees you to live your life in a way that is truly joyous and truly, truly free. And that's something that you can't put a price on. I mean, you have to keep in mind that the ego, again, is essentially, it's a liar, and it's lying to you all the time. And because it's so good at it, we believe the lies that the ego is telling. But it's the constructions of the ego that lead to things like racism, war, violence, crime, abuse, all of these things. These are actually all products of the ego.
Agreed.
And so these are, even if it's not as dramatic as that, the ego creates these problems in people's lives so that they suffer in a way that's unnecessary. And that's really the main point. It's not about achieving some great spiritual state or something like that. It's just about recognizing that, look, there's a whole lot of unnecessary suffering that's going on here. And if you just got clear on yourself, that suffering would actually disappear. And then it's no longer something that you need to worry about. And coming to a deep understanding of the nature of the self, really what I found is all my existential worries just vanished, literally vanished overnight. I have zero fear of death. I have zero fear of, doing the wrong thing spiritually. I'm no longer concerned with ideas of right and wrong. I'm only concerned about authenticity. I'm only concerned about being myself. And that is such a great liberating relief. I mean, one way that I like to demonstrate this with people is, I talk about the energy in their body and how the ego creates these blocks within the natural flow of energy within your being. And one of the ways that I do this is I'll take like a towel and I'll twist that towel all up and, pull it into knots, and I'll show that to people and say, this is what your ego is doing to you inside. It's creating an energetic structure that's similar to this knot that I've just created. Now, you can walk around with this knot inside of you and all the problems that creates, or you can learn how to smooth this out, and then I will smooth out the towel and open it up and make it nice and flat. Or your energy can be like this. Now, which do you think is going to be more pleasant for you? And that's all that it boils down to, ultimately. And if more people were like that, this world would be so different. We wouldn't have these absurd political races going on. We wouldn't have these financial crises. We wouldn't have so much of what happens within human cultures and society. It would just be gone.
See, that's what frustrates me the most is when I do psychedelics, the more I do them, the more frustrated I get dealing with the society that we've built. Dealing with cops or getting my car registered. I'm like, why the fuck do I have to do this? We should be just free, and this is bullshit, and it's costing me money, and it's hard for me to go to work at my 9-to-5 job. Increasingly every day when I'm dealing with this, and I'm like, this is not the point of this experience. And, it's really frustrating because I feel like society's been around for a long time, and somebody somewhere should have been able to better prepare this for my experience.
Yeah. Well,
that'd be less frustrating.
Kind of the way that I look at that now is, for one, I've developed within myself this unconditional sense of love. So even as frustrating and as terrible as things may be, and as awful as people's choices may be, I still have this overriding sense of love for all beings and all things. So for me, that really takes precedent, so there's this kind of a sense of sympathy there, because really I just see myself in a confused form when I see people making bad decisions. So I really just see myself, and what I want is for myself to be clear. And seeing that in the other person. So I'm able to let go of judgment in that sense. Now, one thing that I like to say is like, look, I love everyone. It doesn't mean I like everyone personally. It doesn't mean I want to personally interact with people who are terribly confused and just spewing out all kinds of garbage. But I still love them. At the most fundamental level, I still love them. And also, what's important is that we have to recognize that we actually can't change the world. And we do live within a society that has all these false structures. I mean, we're built on a culture that revolves around money, which ultimately is a non-real thing. Money only exists because we agree that it has value, but it doesn't have any inherent value. So actually money is very, very similar to the ego, because the ego doesn't really exist. It's just an imaginary agreement that we make with ourselves that I am this person, and I'm going to put value on these thoughts, beliefs, and ideas. And so money is the same way. And that's what our society is built on. And kind of in the sense that, look, I still need to use my ego when I'm out interacting with other people, or else I will tend to freak them out. Or, you know, who knows what else might happen. We still need to work. You know, that's still a reality of mine. I need to work. I've just got downsized at the university where I work, so adjunct professors, they're taking classes away from us so that they don't have to pay us health insurance. So now instead of teaching 3 classes a term, I'm only teaching 1. I mean, this is just the reality. But within that, you can still be yourself. This is the lesson that I've learned, is you can always be yourself. You can always choose to be authentic to yourself, and sometimes that means that there might be consequences for that. But as long as you're being yourself, you will still feel good about yourself and about your reality, because you will know that even though other people are confused and so they're bringing all kinds of harshness into your reality, at least you've done what you can to be yourself. And so it's always about trusting that you can express yourself and you can be yourself, and not live in fear of, well, what would happen if I did something different? But also recognizing that, you know, to some extent we have to play the game, because society isn't enlightened yet. It hasn't happened. It's not there. So we have to live within that reality. It's about respecting what is actual within reality, and then choosing to always be ourselves within that. And one last little bit I would give here is that also in looking at just the difficult trajectory of human history, is from this point I really look at it as, well, human beings, we've actually been in an evolutionarily speaking kind of a childhood stage. And we've really been able to use the planet as our playground, and we've been able to form different teams, and we're out there playing on the playground, and some of us are bullies, and some of us get bullied. But essentially we've been little kids, because we haven't understood who we are. We're all out there playing and pretending to be something that we're not, when the reality is each and every one of us is God. And it's actually about time that we started living up to that. It's time for human beings to grow up and stop playing the bullshit make-believe games, because it's getting kind of nasty here on the playground. And we're a bit more mature than that now. So it's just time. But that maturing takes time. It takes people being willing to commit themselves to learning who they truly are, and then living in that reality rather than within the illusions. It's not easy growing up. So I have a lot of sympathy in that respect. But at the same time, I also recognize that I personally have a limited amount of patience, because I also recognize that I only have a limited amount of time in this body and from this experience. And I really would like the planet to get as best as it can be in the time period that I have. So that's why I invest my energy in writing books and, you know, speaking on podcasts about how people can find clarity, because I want to share that, because these are all just other versions of me, and I know that I appreciate the clarity. And if I appreciate it from this body, from this perspective, I can appreciate it from those other ones as well. So I do what I can to spread clarity, but ultimately it's up to individuals. Everyone's got to do it for themselves, because there's no savior out there to take care of everyone and hold our hands and wipe our ass and blow our nose for us. We got to do it.
Amen, sir. Well, hey, before we go, I want to get to a couple of questions that were submitted by readers on the Higherside Chats forum and on Reddit, if that's cool with you.
Yeah.
Well, from the forum, Kyle says he loves being human, number one, and he has 2 questions. How do we transform society to use psychedelics as a coming-of-age experience rather than a criminal offense? And I'll let you answer that, because the other one's not really related.
Okay. Well, I actually put out a podcast just last month where, for the first time on my podcast, I spoke about marijuana. And I did it because a lot of people have asked me, well, what do you think about marijuana? And I realized I'd never talked about it on the podcast. And I always kind of felt that it was sort of an obvious issue. But something that came to mind in really thinking about it was, well, look, if there's one issue, if there's one linchpin issue that actually could turn the tide of virtually everything within society, from politics to police to incarceration to laws to way we deal with youth and education and healthcare and economics and fuel and building materials and virtually everything else, that one issue would be pot, would be marijuana. And I think that this is what now we're seeing in the United States, that we're really reaching a tipping point where more and more people are accepting of marijuana. And I would classify marijuana as kind of a mild entheogen. So I think that in turning the tide of helping to end prohibition on marijuana, that actually could be the watershed moment that allows the re-entry, the legitimate,
right.
the above,
The gateway, if you will.
re-entry of these kinds of medicines back into our society. And I think that people have been chipping away at this for a long time with medical marijuana and local votes and things like that. But I think that once that floodgate opens up, I think that's really where things are going to change. And at that point, then we really might be able to talk about, well, how do we introduce these things to our youth? I mean, it's still such, I mean, it's an issue when you raise the issue of pot. The politicians who are against it always say, oh, the children, and that's the only thing they really have to say anymore, because all the propaganda has been disproven. So I think that would then allow us to start having this discussion at a more culture-wide level. And I think people are getting ready for it. But I think if we could break that issue with marijuana, that's the one to focus on. So that's my brief answer to that.
Right on. His other question, I think I kind of know what you're going to say, but do you think there are other types of life or beings that are connected to us beyond the five senses?
No. I mean, it'd be great if there were. I really think it would be great. I think it'd be really interesting. But no, essentially. And I guess also when I would say beyond the five senses, I would want to mention that physiologically your heart generates a very large electromagnetic field. And it's important for people to actually understand that their heart is, in many respects, an extremely sophisticated sense organ. Okay, so we talk about, well, you have the touch and you have smell and sight and hearing and taste and all these things. When we talk about the five senses, and sometimes people want to talk about the third eye or something like that. I just like to call that the divine imagination, as I write about in Being Human. But the heart actually is a sense organ. And look, actually, since we're all one being, when the energy of the ego drops, the heart energy between two different physical beings can completely coincide with each other, and they experience themselves as looking at each other in a mirror. And it's really quite beautiful and quite profound. So in that sense, we certainly can connect through ways that aren't just our visual senses, our physical senses, that we have this energetic field of the heart, which is very, very powerful and influences every aspect of our experience. But in terms of inner psychic space and things like that, no, it's all you. And it can be so convincingly other. I mean, that's the really fun part about it, that it can seem like, wow, there's some insect alien here looking at me, and what the hell?
Right, machine elves and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this stuff. I know it's there, but it's almost like this joke where suddenly you realize, oh my God, that's me. I'm just looking in a mirror. I've created this image in the mirror, and it's me. It's one way I describe it is like, imagine you're at a puppet show and you're watching this puppet show, and you're having a great time. You're just engrossed in the puppet show, but suddenly you realize that the puppets are actually sitting on your own hands, and you're the one acting out the show. But you thought you were just a member of the audience, and that's essentially what's going on there.
Right on. Okay, Carrie from the THC forums as well, she asks, regarding the Occupy movement and other uprisings around the world, what's your advice to people who dissent against oppressive governments, and do you think this awakening and rebellion are in any shape or form related to the idea of 2012 and a new age of evolution?
No, I think the whole 2012 thing is a lot of smoke and mirrors. So first of all, I would just radically dismiss that. I think the Occupy movement, I think it's really important. I think it's really powerful because essentially what's happening there is unfortunately, it kind of takes this, that we need to reach the breaking point where things get bad enough that people actually decide, well, fuck it, I'm not going to take it anymore. I'm going to do something about it. And so that's kind of the point that we're reaching. And so in that sense, I'm very excited about it. And I think that it's an incredibly important thing that people take action. I mean, that's all about being true to your energy. If you see something, if you feel something, act on it. Don't just sit around and, oh, when's somebody else going to do it? Or, why won't things just get better? It doesn't work that way. But within that, I would also urge people to, as deep as the frustration may become, and especially when we see the haves versus the have-nots, and, we see the fat cats up there in their balconies sipping champagne and smoking cigars and laughing at the protesters, that it's really easy to get into dualistic oppositions of it's us versus them. And it's just important to always remember, hey, we're all one. Literally, we're all one being. And that person sitting up there drinking the champagne and laughing at the protesters, that's you too. That's actually you. So just keep that in mind in terms of how you direct your passions and how you let your thoughts shape around the issues. Because dividing is never going to do anything. It needs to be the recognition that, look, what we really want to share with the 1% is, hey, we really are all one. So do we really need to have this radical social stratification? Do we need to have the dominators and the dominated? Do we need to have the manipulators and the manipulated? Why are we creating these relationships? Because, it affects them too. That's the thing, is there's no such thing as a one-way street. That given the disparities within society and the suffering that it causes at the lower financial end of the spectrum, well, those people on the top end of the spectrum, they're afraid. They've got all kinds of fear and all kinds of unhappiness and all kinds of their own ego confusion. So actually we can be compassionate for them. And so I would just always urge, I used to be so passionate about so many social issues. I used to go door to door and raising money and signing petitions and writing letters and making phone calls. And, now I've really focused on how do I help individual people, because that's where I see the most effective means of making real change. Because the danger of engaging in society and trying to affect change that way is that just new ego patterns take over, and they might be better for a while, but ultimately, as long as we're dealing with the ego, we're dealing with illusions, and so there's always going to be a sense of dissatisfaction and a less than optimal result from that. And so that's, again, why the clarity, the personal individual clarity becomes so important, so that we don't keep making the same kinds of mistakes and putting out the same kinds of projections. But overall, I would just say good luck to all the protesters. Always keep it real, and yes, act on what you feel. And especially when it's so tempting to get mad and angry, get in touch with your heart. It's not about what you think, it's about what you feel. So get in touch with what you feel and then act from that place. And as long as you're doing that, you're doing the right thing.
Nice. You got time for two more?
Sure.
All right. From Reddit, user Frank769 asks, what contributes to the social stigma against psychedelics in society, and in what way does said stigma benefit corporations, government, and established religions?
Okay, that's a kind of a big question. But for one, overall, larger society does not understand psychedelics, okay? Most cultures around the world historically don't understand psychedelics, and even in cultures where psychedelics have been used, many times they've only been used by an elite group within that society. So maybe the society at large doesn't even really know about that. Now, of course, there are many exceptions to that, especially in Central and South America. But look, for example, in Hinduism, most Hindus would say that psychedelics have nothing whatsoever to do with their religion, and they would look at that as something strange and as something unacceptable. But there are members in the Hindu tradition, particularly Shaivites, who spend a great deal of time smoking pot and eating mushrooms and doing things like that. But even within their own culture and society, they're not well understood. So historically, just there hasn't been widespread knowledge of what these things really are and what they really do. So there's a lot of fear. because it's very clear to everyone that they have very, very powerful effects. But since it's not understood, that there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of misunderstanding there. Also, just in terms of our own contemporary modern society, our modern society would much prefer people to drink alcohol and to become numb egos than it would prefer people to become truly awake and aware, because that serves the power structures within our society better. And it's not necessarily even a conscious choice that people are making. It's just the way that it is, that the current structures of our society are not served by people working with psychedelics and entheogens. And of course, for those of us who do, we say, well, yeah, that's because we actually can see how life can be a lot better, that we can change a lot of the ways that we do things. But the ego is always resistant to change. The ego is always more comfortable with things that it thinks it knows versus things it thinks it doesn't know. So psychedelics and entheogens, they're a great big fear out there. And of course, the way that the ego works is that it projects everything onto what it fears. And so there's a great deal of illusion between reality and the way that mainstream society really looks at psychedelics. I think that the fact that now there's a resurgence in psychedelic research, I think that is really going to help change a lot of attitudes. And, things like doing this podcast, because the more that people hear about these things and realize that maybe it's not all the frou-frou stuff they thought it was, and maybe it's not all the crazy stuff they thought it was too. Maybe there's some really, really profound and powerful things here. I mean, we can see that it helps people with all kinds of mental issues and emotional issues and psychological issues. There again, I do think that the tide is turning, but it takes people being willing to talk about it openly and discuss it, because as long as it's just underground and it's more just secret society, countercultural stuff, and, it can kind of burn out or whatever, it's time to bring it out into the open. Let's talk about it.
I hear you. All right, lastly, this Reddit pimp Dolderer, he wants to know if you're familiar with Rick Strassman's hypothesis on DMT, which of course I know you are. Yes. That said, what's your take on the pineal gland and its usefulness, considering your philosophy?
Yeah, this is an important one. Rick Strassman clearly stated in his research, in no uncertain terms,